Well, today we're going to look at the Apostle Paul's Areopagus sermon uh, and its audience. Um, as I said last week, this text in Acts 17:22 and following has challenged me for years. I sometimes say it's dogged me, it's hounded me, I just can't get rid of it. It started when I was in college, and that's a long time ago. I did an exegesis of it in my Acts class in college. I published it shortly after, published an article in the Christian Standard shortly after moving to Germany back in 1972, 73. I guess it came out in 1974 and in the Christian Standard. I used it there as a kind of a model for preaching to highly educated people. It became an interest to me, and I really tried to convince my doctor father to let me write a dissertation on Acts 17. And he said, well, there's been so much already written about that sermon. Why don't you look at the creation themes in the book of Romans and compare the Acts sermon with the Romans sermon as you go? And I said, or the Romans epistle. I said, oh, okay, whatever you say. So that's what I did. So there's one chapter in my dissertation that you'll hear more about next week when we talk about Romans 1 and 2 in relation to this Areopagus sermon. I actually published that piece in a little different form in the Restoration Quarterly. It's about 1978 or 79. I guess it was 77. I do have notes here. So anyhow, it doesn't seem to want to leave me in peace. But I think it's partly my own fault because I've sort of pretended to know something about New Testament and preaching, and so the preaching in the New Testament has been an interest of mine right along. And when rhetorical criticism started to become big in the Society of Biblical Literature and other places, it really caught my eye. And George Kennedy, of course, in North Carolina, sort of led that charge, and it's been helpful to me. A conviction that underlies this whole work of mine is that the purpose of the book of Acts, it seems to me that even though not everybody agrees, that the book of Acts must have been written by, there's Joy. Hi, Joy.
Yes.
Must have been written to help the second generation of the church do something. And it has so many sermons, so many speeches of one sort or another in it, that it seems to me that it became a model pretty early on of how to preach the different kinds of audiences. And so the idea that he would have put a sermon in the book of Acts that was a complete failure never has made any sense to me, even though some scholars that I appreciate think that because Paul said in 1 Corinthians that he determined to know nothing among them except for Christ and him crucified, and he went to Corinth right from Athens, that must mean he thought he had failed in Athens. I just can't understand that. So I see Acts as a manual for life in the early church, and the sermons as examples of sermons to different audiences. And if you look closely at each of the major sermons there by a number of different people, you'll see that the audience seems to be different in each one. Several of them are all Jewish, but even then, it's Hellenistic Judaism with the Stephen sermon. It's Temple Judaism on Pentecost and so forth. It's just a little bit different every time. So I want to try to understand myself and help you to understand how this audience of Stoics and Epicureans specifically would have heard Paul's sermon to them, or Paul's defense, or whatever it is. It's a speech. They ask him to come and talk to them about it. I'm also, of course, a retired seminary professor, so I'm going to begin with a little work on with my imagination on the Apostle Paul as a student. Imagine the young theology student wondering how in the world all the stuff he had been studying in school should ever be of any earthly good to anybody. Ever run into that sort of thing, John?
A few times.
He had learned about pagan religions, which he vehemently rejected. He wanted nothing to do with Hellenistic idol worshippers, but he had been subjected to that tired Greek legend about the flock of sanctified sheep let loose in Athens to mark by their lying down on various spots the locations of various idols. He'd been made to ponder their philosophers, trying to understand the quirky view of reality of a misguided man named Plato. Oh yes, Plato was something of a monotheist, but he thought the only good was spiritual, and that all matter was at least inferior, if not evil. So our seminarian, who believed in the God who created the material universe, the God who got directly involved in the affairs of this material creation, was puzzled. As a student, he had even memorized some of the works of the pagan poets, apparently, works which even Plato had expressed discomfort with. It had been all he could do to pronounce the name Zeus in that little ditty about all mankind being his offspring. And all that about the cycles of history. He had heard in the school of rhetoric in Tarsus something to the effect that God forms the world and then takes it back into himself through a universal conflagration, so that there's an unending series of world constructions and world destructions. Moreover, each new world, Copplestone said, that resembles its predecessor in all particulars. I got a lot of this stuff from Copplestone, a historian of philosophy. How can anybody believe that cyclic view of history? Nothing is ever the same. Anybody can see that. If there's any meaning to human life, it's found in the goal of history, not its repetition. It seems that a lot of time is wasted studying strange cultures, absurd philosophies, out-of-date methodologies, dead languages, weird pieces of literature, or trying to make sense of the debates of old men who delighted in splitting hairs painstakingly plucked from their pet metaphors. Oh, I love that sentence. That's mine. Why couldn't we just get a compendium of the truth and training in how to apply it and then pass that on to the next generation? All right. Is there a theology student anywhere who at some time or another would not sympathize with such thinking? Do all students have trouble imagining 5 years from now having any real use for Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, or history, or philosophy, or theology, or anthropology, or literature? Do they not think that one course in the Christian faith and one big Bible content course would suffice if combined with speech management, counseling, and leadership? Of course. The education of the Apostle Paul in Tarsus and Jerusalem is not documented for us, but scholars do indicate that Tarsus was a major center of rhetorical, philosophical education in the first century. And it is also clear that the Pharisees were interested in communicating Judaism to the Hellenistic culture so that we can assume some critical analysis of Hellenism in the school, even of Gamaliel and in Jerusalem. If the negative thinking I've just gone through was known to young Saul. It must have all disappeared when Paul, the Christian evangelist, arrived in Athens and was given the opportunity to speak to the Areopagus. All that information, which had previously seemed so useless, must have come flooding back as he saw the idols and heard the conversations. I think the best description of this scene is the one that James Stewart put in his Faith to Proclaim back in 1953. He said, "It is worth trying to visualize the scene, for what happened that day was not simply an itinerant evangelist addressing a wayside congregation. It was not just one more Christian sermon. It was something much more dramatic. It was the encounter of two rival interpretations of life. It was the clash and the collision of two great tidal waves of history. Here was Athens, sophisticated, questioning, speculative Athens. And here was this little Jew with his uncouth accent and his burning eyes. Here was the heart of classical culture. And here was this man of one explosive theme, God incarnate, crucified, and risen. Here was the Hellenic philosophic temperament, and here the Hebrew prophetic fire. Here was Mars Hill, and here challenging it, the hill of Calvary. Here was the Mount of the Areopagus, and here the Mount of Zion. When Paul stood up that day in Athens to preach Jesus and the resurrection, two worlds had met. The voice of prophecy was being fulfilled. Zechariah 9:13, thy sons, O Zion, against thy sons, O Greece. And then it happened. All that reading, discussing, memorizing, and thinking came together. Luke tells us, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens. This form of address was the conventional form found in the Greek orators as an address to Hellenistic courts, Kennedy says. Paul was about to defend the Christian gospel in the Supreme Court of Greek philosophy. Paul must have known that both Stoic and Epicurean philosophers had deep reservations about the popular myths of Greece and that they could see no divinity in idols. So he started by dealing rather lightly with the idols which were so numerous in Athens. Thus, he complimented his audience, both directly by his opening statement and indirectly by saying next something he knew they would agree with. And then he gradually introduced the topics which he expected to be more difficult for the philosophers to accept. So then he identified God as the creator of the whole universe, spirit and matter, all humankind. Copleston indicates that this would not be difficult for the Stoics to swallow, although as we shall see, the Epicureans would likely have seen little sense in it. God, Paul indicated, even made mundane decisions about seasons and territories. Check out verses 24, 25, and 26. It shouldn't be difficult to imagine those philosophers at this point thinking, but Zeno said, but Epicurus said, but Plato said that the divinity is spirit and then therefore cannot have direct contact with matter. Epicurus, for instance, didn't deny the existence of gods, but in order to free people from fear and superstition, he claimed that the divinities do not interfere in human affairs. He also taught that all that exists is composed of eternally existent atoms. In addition, he held that these atoms are organized merely by chance. Sound familiar? However, philosophers always think with howevers, of course. However, this idea of God as creating out of nothing, instead of forming eternally existent matter, does solve some problems about the origin of matter. This would have been especially appealing to the Stoics, who used the chain of cause and effect as a proof of the existence of an intelligent divinity. Poseidonus of Apamea, a Stoic during the 1st century before Christ, worked out such arguments rather systematically, as did a number of Christians later. And furthermore, that's another favorite term of philosophers. Furthermore, the possibility of the ongoing influence of the divinity closes some other gaps. So they say, let's hear what this babbler has to say. Babbler, by the way, translates the Greek word spermologos, which is usually assumed to be a term of derision, like a little bird going around picking up seeds out of manure piles or something. But the author of our text, Luke, might have been aware that Stoics used the two halves of this term, logos and spermos, in a very positive way. Copleston points out, God, therefore, hologos, is the active principle which contains within itself the active forms of being, the logoi spermatikoi. These active forms, but material, are as it were seeds through the activity of which individual things come into being as the world develops. Or rather, they are seeds which unfold themselves in the form of individual things. So those two terms separately, in a sense, were used by the Stoics in explaining creation. Anyhow, about that time, the speaker's voice sounds through again to claim that God actually wants human beings to reach out and find him, that in fact he dwells nearby. Verses 27, 28. This guy makes God sound almost kind. The Greeks, it seems to me, kept their religious duties so that the gods would mind their own business, since it seemed that when the gods got involved with human life, nasty things happened, like earthquakes and volcanoes and storms and pandemics. The Epicureans did their best to liberate people from fearing the gods by assuring them that the gods were not involved with human activities. But Paul makes it sound as though his divinity wants people to know him. And he warrants this suggestion by quoting a fragment of a hymn to Zeus. There are two hymns that this can kind of sound familiar to, one by Cleanthes and one by Aratus. The one by Cleanthes goes like this, the opening lines of it. God most glorious, called by many a name, nature's great king, through endless years the same, omnipotence who by thy just decree controllest all, hail Zeus. For unto thee behooves the creatures in all lands to call. We are thy children, we alone, of all on earth's broad ways that wander to and fro, bearing thy image where'er we go. And Aratus, who was a contemporary of Cleanthes, and they were high-ranking Stoic teachers, wrote in his Phenomena, this is really a thing about astrology, but he starts off with a poem to Zeus. He says, from Zeus let us begin. Him do we mortals never leave unnamed. Full of Zeus are all the streets and all the marketplaces of man. Full is the earth and the heavens. Therefore, always we all have need of Zeus, for we are also his offspring. That's a direct parallel with what Paul was quoting there. So it's interesting that a number of the philosophers, Stoic philosophers, would really have known those poems. Then Paul switches back to common ground with all the philosophers, reminding them of the absurdity of idolatry, Acts 17:28. When he had them agreeing with him again, he called the whole thing ignorance and assured them that God had decided to overlook that episode. But then he hit them with a warning. But now God commands all people everywhere to repent. Those highly valued minds must be changed. The Greek word metanoia means to change one's mind, but as Paul soon makes clear, this change is a radical paradigm shift. Philosophers, of course, are always in the process of changing their minds over this or that detail. They're willing to entertain new ideas and to fit them into their frames of reference. After all, that's what gave Paul this opportunity in the first place. Repent, why not, if it makes sense? It's important to note that there's a double, what I call a double dialectic at work in this call to repentance. The preacher has just finished saying that God had overlooked the ignorance of the past. But now he indicates that ignorance can no longer be used as an excuse for anybody who's not worshiping the true God. We'll get into this in a little more detail next week when we look at Romans 1, because there he says there is no excuse. And so a lot of people have said he couldn't have preached this sermon in Britain, Romans 1, but we'll talk about that. He states, to the Areopagites, he gives the assurance that the past is not so important as the present. And the present is their opportunity to change their old ways of thinking and adopt a new way. This second point of tension will become clear as Paul proceeds to attack more basic tenets of the Greek worldview. To change one's mind about details of reality is part of the discipline of philosophy, but to change one's mind about the very nature of that reality is a much more complex and painful process. And it will soon become clear that this is precisely what Paul is calling for. So Paul here then aims a double blow at the whole Hellenistic worldview. He proclaims a day of judgment and the resurrection of a man from the dead, all sort of in one breath in the 31st verse. One can almost see the Stoics and Epicureans squirming and hear them arguing. Wait, Paulos, you've gone too far. We all know that history rolls along eternally in cycles. But history ending in a day of judgment? A human body returning from death and becoming a divine judge? Copleston says that in their opinion, the world is due to mechanical causes and there is no need to postulate teleology. That is the idea that there's going to be an end, that's all going to come to a great conclusion. And furthermore, if death is, as it seemed to the Stoic, a welcome escape from the body, why would anybody want to think about resurrection of the body? It appears that Paul was invited, you remember, to speak because some of them understood him to be proclaiming two new deities, Jesus and Anastasis, Jesus and Anastasis, which would have been the feminine pair of these new divinities. But now they realize he's using this word Anastasis in a literal sense. He's really talking about somebody coming back from life, to life from the dead. At this point in the speech, it must have become clear to Paul's hearers that Anastasis is not a proper noun, but an event. That was too much for even the Stoics, who had so much in common with Paul and his fellow Christians. Seneca, a Stoic contemporary of Paul's, who was teaching Nero in Rome, his teaching tended toward anthropological dualism, in terms of conflict between the soul and the body. He wrote, "For this body of ours is a weight upon the soul and its penance. As the load presses down, the soul is crushed and is in bondage." Epicurus said that the soul was dissipated or dissolved in the air shortly after the death of the body. Cumont, who back in 1922 published a book on the afterlife among Stoics, wrote that the true Stoic doctrine is then that souls, when they leave the corpse, subsist in the atmosphere, and especially in its highest part, which touches the circle of the moon. But after a longer or less interval of time, they, like the flesh and bones, are decomposed and dissolved into the elements which framed them.
Hey, Bruce.
Yeah.
Bruce, we're at 1.5 minutes left. So I don't know if you want to start another session or if we want to just wrap it up here.
I'm almost wrapping it up here.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay.
Well, nice try, Paul. As I say, I don't think he thought this was a failure, because we're told that he converted Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, Damaris, apparently a well-known woman around there, and a number of other people. And in fact, as I said, the Acts, I think the author of Acts included the sermon as a model for reaching the Hellenistic thinkers. And I think Paul trudged down the road toward Corinth. It was about a 40-mile trip, thanking God that he had paid attention in the Academy of Rhetoric in Tarsus and the School of Gamaliel in Jerusalem. Thanking God for his seminary professors.
So he's the one.
So, any quick questions? It says less than a minute here.
I was going to say it's going to disappear really fast. So
thanks for your attention, everybody.
thank you. That was good. That was
Thank you.
interesting.
Y'all take care.